Nobody in the building could remember the last time sunlight touched the floor of apartment 7B. Not the retired couple downstairs. Not the mailman who had walked the hallway for years. Not even the building manager who had known every tenant by name. The curtains had remained closed for so long that people eventually stopped noticing them. Until one day someone did. Margaret Collins lived alone on the 7th floor of a quiet apartment building overlooking a busy street in Brooklyn. She had lived there for 11 years. 11 birthdays. 11 Christmas mornings. 11 springs filled with bright sunshine she never allowed inside. Every morning at exactly 7:10, she walked to the corner grocery store. Every afternoon at exactly 3:45, she returned carrying 2 small bags. And every evening just before sunset, a warm amber lamp flickered to life behind the curtains of apartment 7B. Then the window disappeared into darkness again. The routine never changed. The neighbors had theories, of course. They always did. Some believed Margaret simply hated people. Others thought she was protecting some secret. A few even claimed she was afraid of the outside world. But none of them had ever spoken to her long enough to know the truth. Because Margaret was always polite. Always quiet. Always distant. She smiled when necessary. Nodded in the elevator. Said thank you when someone held the door. Then she disappeared behind the same closed curtains once again. Over time, people stopped trying to understand her. It was easier to invent explanations than ask questions. Easier to call someone strange than wonder what pain they might be carrying. Across the hall, however, a new tenant had recently moved in. Emily Parker was 31 years old, worked remotely, and noticed things other people ignored. She noticed that Margaret never looked toward her own window when entering the apartment. She noticed that every grocery bag contained fresh flowers, even though nobody ever visited. She noticed that whenever sunlight streamed through the hallway window, Margaret's expression changed for just a second. Almost like a memory had reached out and touched her. One rainy Tuesday evening, Emily returned home carrying takeout and saw Margaret standing alone near her apartment door. For a brief moment, the older woman seemed frozen. Not confused. Not frightened. Just lost somewhere far away. Then she blinked, smiled politely, and stepped inside apartment 7B. The door closed softly. A second later, Emily heard the familiar sound of curtains being adjusted from the inside. Not opened. Never opened. Just checked. As though Margaret needed to make absolutely certain they remained shut. Emily stood there listening to the rain tap against the hallway window. Something about it didn't make sense. People closed curtains at night. People closed curtains during storms. But nobody kept them closed every hour of every day for 11 years. Unless there was something on the other side they could not bear to see. And for the first time, Emily found herself wondering the same question nobody in the building had ever been able to answer. What happened 11 years ago that made Margaret Collins close her curtains forever? The next morning, Emily could not stop thinking about apartment 7B. She told herself it was none of her business. People were entitled to their privacy. People carried burdens they did not owe anyone an explanation for. Yet something about Margaret Collins lingered in her mind long after she logged into work and poured her first cup of coffee. It was not the closed curtains. It was the feeling behind them. The feeling that an entire life had quietly disappeared from view. Around noon, Emily stepped into the hallway to collect a package. As she reached for it, she noticed Margaret returning from the elevator with her usual grocery bags. The older woman moved carefully, almost automatically, following the same routine she had probably followed thousands of times before. Emily smiled. Margaret smiled back. It was warm but brief. The kind of smile people gave when they wanted to be kind without inviting conversation. As Margaret unlocked her apartment door, one of the grocery bags shifted. A small bundle of white flowers peeked out from the top. Emily noticed them immediately. Fresh flowers. Again. She had seen them before. Every week. Sometimes. Twice a week. Yet she had never once seen flowers inside Margaret's apartment. No vase in the window. No bouquet in the lobby trash. It was as if the flowers simply vanished after crossing the threshold. The door closed softly. Silence returned to the hallway. Later that evening, rain tapped gently against the building windows. The city outside glowed with headlights and reflections. Emily sat on her couch reading when a sudden thought crossed her mind. She had lived across from Margaret for nearly 3 months, yet she had never heard visitors. No family. No friends. No deliveries except groceries. No holiday gatherings. Nothing. And still every week fresh flowers appeared. Around 9 o'clock, Emily stepped into the hallway to throw away a bag of trash. As she passed apartment 7B, she noticed something unusual. The apartment door was not fully closed. Just a fraction of an inch remained open. Not enough to see much. Only a narrow slice of warm amber light. Emily immediately looked away. She did not want to invade someone's privacy. But as she turned, something caught her eye. On the wall inside the apartment hung dozens of framed photographs. Dozens. Every visible frame appeared to contain the same person. A man smiling beside Margaret. A man standing near a window. A man holding flowers. A man laughing in summer sunlight. Before Emily could see more, the door clicked shut. The glimpse lasted only seconds. Yet it changed everything. For the first time, Margaret's loneliness seemed connected to someone specific. Someone who had once filled those photographs with life. Someone who no longer appeared anywhere except on the walls of apartment 7B. That night, the rain continued past midnight. Emily stood by her own window watching the city lights shimmer through the storm. Across the hall, behind the permanently closed curtains, the familiar amber lamp still glowed. Then, at exactly 11:18 p.m., it switched off. And for a brief moment before darkness swallowed the room completely, Emily thought she saw the faint silhouette of Margaret standing beside the hidden window, staring toward something she could never bring herself to see again. The photograph stayed in Emily's mind for days. She could still picture the man standing beside Margaret, smiling into the sunlight as if life had been simple back then. There had been something different about Margaret in that image. Something lighter. The woman in the frame looked like someone who laughed easily. Someone who expected tomorrow to arrive with good news. It was difficult to connect that version of Margaret to the quiet figure, who now disappeared behind closed curtains every evening. A few days later, Saturday arrived wrapped in gray clouds and cool autumn air. Emily spent the morning working from her apartment until she realized she had run out of coffee. Around 10 o'clock, she walked to the neighborhood market. As she entered, she immediately spotted Margaret near the flower section. The older woman was carefully examining a small arrangement of white lilies. She stood there longer than most people would. Not shopping. Remembering. At least that was how it seemed. Emily almost walked over to say hello but stopped herself. Something about Margaret's expression suggested she was somewhere far away. Eventually Margaret selected the flowers, paid quietly, and left. Emily watched through the front window as she crossed the street alone. The flowers rested gently against her coat, as though they mattered more than anything else she carried. Later that afternoon, Emily found herself speaking with Mrs. Henderson, an elderly resident who had lived in the building for nearly 20 years. If anyone knew Margaret's story, it would be her. At first, Mrs. Henderson simply shrugged. Margaret was different when she moved in, she said. Not outgoing exactly, but happier. Emily listened carefully. Did she have family? She asked. Mrs. Henderson thought for a moment. I remember seeing a man visit during the first year. Tall, brown hair, always carrying flowers. Emily felt a quiet chill. Daniel? She asked before thinking. The older woman looked surprised. Yes, I think that was his name. Then her expression softened. After a while he stopped coming. Not long after that, the curtains closed. Emily waited for more. But Mrs. Henderson only shook her head. Nobody ever knew exactly what happened. People asked. Margaret never answered. That evening rain drifted across the city again. Emily sat by her window watching water slide down the glass. Across the hall, the familiar amber light appeared behind Margaret's curtains. It felt almost comforting now, like proof that someone was still there. Around 9:30, Emily stepped into the hallway to retrieve a delivery. As she passed apartment 7B, she heard something unexpected. Music. Soft piano music. Slow and beautiful. The melody floated beneath the door so quietly that she almost missed it. Emily stood still. The music sounded old. Not sad exactly. More like a memory trying to survive. Then she heard another sound. A faint voice. Margaret was speaking to someone. At first Emily assumed she had a visitor. But the hallway remained empty. No footsteps. No second voice. Nothing. Only Margaret speaking softly inside the apartment. The words were too faint to understand. Then the music stopped. Silence returned. Emily continued toward her apartment, but one thought followed her all night. If Margaret lived completely alone, who had she been talking to? And why did it sound like a conversation she had been having for years? The question stayed with Emily long after the music faded. She told herself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Margaret was speaking on the phone. Maybe she was listening to an old recording. Maybe loneliness simply made people hold conversations with memories. Yet none of those explanations felt complete. The next few days passed quietly. The weather grew colder. Trees along the street began shedding the last of their autumn leaves. The city moved forward as it always did. But apartment 7B seemed frozen in a different season entirely. On Wednesday morning, Emily left for work at a nearby coffee shop. As she stepped into the elevator, she found Margaret already inside. The older woman held her usual grocery bag and another bundle of white lilies. They rode in silence for a few floors before Margaret glanced down at the flowers and smiled faintly. They were his favorite, she said. Emily blinked in surprise. She had not asked a question. For a moment she wondered if Margaret had somehow read her thoughts. Then she realized the older woman was not really speaking to her. She was speaking to a memory. The elevator doors opened. Margaret stepped out and continued toward her apartment. Emily stood there watching until the doors closed again. The simple sentence echoed in her mind all day. They were his favorite. Not our. Were. That single word carried years of sadness. That evening, Emily returned home later than usual. The hallway was empty except for a small object resting near apartment 7B. Curious, she walked closer. It was a greeting card that had slipped from a stack of mail. The envelope was old and slightly faded. Margaret's name appeared on the front in elegant handwriting. Emily carefully picked it up and knocked on the apartment door. A few moments later, Margaret opened it. "This was outside," Emily said, handing over the envelope. Margaret looked at it and immediately froze. Not dramatically, just enough for Emily to notice. The color seemed to drain from her expression. For several seconds she stared at the handwriting without speaking. Then she whispered, "Thank you." Before closing the door, she added something unexpected. "This was the last birthday card he ever gave me." The door shut gently. Emily remained standing in the hallway. Her heart ached in a way she could not explain. She was beginning to understand that Margaret's life had not become smaller because she disliked people. It had become smaller because every object inside that apartment seemed connected to someone she had lost. Later that night, Emily could not sleep. Around midnight, she walked to her kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed her window, she glanced across the courtyard toward the opposite side of the building. From that angle, she could see part of Margaret's apartment through a narrow gap where the curtains did not fully meet. The opening was only a few inches wide, but it revealed something important. On a small table beside the hidden window sat dozens of greeting cards. Dozens. Carefully arranged. Some faded with age. Some tied together with ribbon. Beside them stood framed photographs and fresh white lilies. Looked less like a living room and more like a place devoted to remembering. Then Emily noticed one final detail. Every card carried the same handwriting. The same handwriting she had seen on the envelope that evening. And suddenly she realized Margaret had not been holding on to a few memories. She had been preserving an entire life. From that night forward, Emily began noticing details she had overlooked before. Not dramatic details. Small ones. The kind that quietly reveal the truth about a person's life. Every Thursday morning, Margaret carried fresh flowers upstairs. Every Sunday afternoon, she sat alone on a bench across the street for exactly 30 minutes before returning home. And every evening, shortly before sunset, she placed a single lamp beside the hidden window and turned it on as though she were keeping a promise no one else knew existed. The routine never changed. One cold afternoon near the end of November, Emily returned home carrying groceries. As she stepped into the lobby, she found Margaret standing beside the building mailbox. The older woman was holding several envelopes in her hands. Most people would have tossed old mail into a drawer without thinking. Margaret handled each piece carefully, almost reverently. Then one envelope slipped from her grasp and drifted to the floor. Emily picked it up before it could slide away. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. For the first time, she did not immediately walk away. Instead, she glanced toward the envelope and smiled sadly. He used to write letters even when he only traveled for a few days. Emily hesitated. "Daniel." Margaret looked surprised but not upset. After a long pause, she nodded. "Daniel." Hearing his name spoken aloud changed something. Until now he had felt like a shadow hidden behind photographs and flowers. Suddenly he became real. Person. A life. A story. Margaret looked down at the envelope. He believed handwritten letters lasted longer than phone calls. Her smile grew faint. He was probably right. Before Emily could respond, the elevator arrived. Margaret stepped inside and disappeared upstairs. Yet the conversation stayed with Emily all evening. Later that night, heavy clouds covered the city. The streets below reflected silver light from passing cars. Around 10 o'clock, Emily noticed something unusual. The lamp inside apartment 7B remained off. It had never been off before. An hour passed. Still no light. Concern quietly settled into her chest. Near midnight, she finally crossed the hallway and knocked gently on Margaret's door. No answer. She waited a moment and knocked again. This time she heard slow footsteps approaching. The door opened. Margaret stood there wearing a gray sweater and holding a tissue. Her eyes looked tired. Not from crying. From remembering. "I am sorry," Emily said. "I noticed your light was off." For a moment Margaret simply stared at her. Then she looked over her shoulder toward the dark apartment. Today would have been our 35th wedding anniversary. Emily felt her heart tighten. Neither woman spoke. Some silences deserved respect. Finally Margaret gave a small nod. "Most days are manageable now," she said quietly. "But some dates still feel heavier than others." Emily understood more than Margaret realized. The flowers. The cards. The photographs. The music. None of it was random. It was how Margaret carried someone she refused to forget. Then, as Emily prepared to leave, her eyes drifted toward a small wooden box resting on a nearby table. It sat beneath dozens of framed photographs. The box was old, carefully polished, and secured with a brass latch. Following Emily's gaze, Margaret's expression changed immediately. The softness vanished. Not from anger. From protection. She stepped slightly in front of it. And in that instant, Emily knew the answers she had been searching for were hidden inside that box. After that evening, Emily stopped thinking of the wooden box as an object. It became a question. A question Margaret had spent 11 years protecting. She never asked about it directly. She respected the invisible boundaries Margaret had built around her memories. But the box remained in her thoughts every time she passed apartment 7B. Winter arrived quietly. The first cold wind swept through the city. Holiday decorations appeared in shop windows. Families carried wrapped gifts. Through crowded sidewalks, music drifted from restaurants and coffee shops. Yet inside the 7th floor hallway, very little changed. Margaret still bought fresh flowers. The lamp still glowed each evening. The curtains remained closed. One afternoon in early December, Emily returned home to find Margaret sitting alone near the lobby Christmas tree. It was unusual. Margaret rarely lingered in shared spaces. She usually moved quickly between the elevator and her apartment. Today she sat quietly watching families come and go. Children laughed near the entrance. Couples carried shopping bags. Friends greeted one another. Margaret observed it all with a soft expression that seemed equal parts happiness and sadness. Emily sat beside her. For a while neither woman spoke. Then Margaret smiled faintly. Daniel loved this time of year. Emily looked toward the Christmas lights. Did he? Margaret nodded. He always believed people were kinder in December. A small laugh escaped her. He spent every Christmas trying to prove it. Emily smiled. Sounds like a good man. Margaret stared at the lights for several seconds. He was. The answer came instantly. Without hesitation. Without doubt. As though 11 years had not changed it at all. A few moments later Margaret stood and prepared to leave. Then she paused. Would you help me carry something upstairs tomorrow? She asked. Emily was surprised. It was the first time Margaret had ever requested anything. Of course, she said. The next afternoon Emily knocked on apartment 7B. When the door opened she stepped inside for the first time. The apartment felt exactly as she had imagined. Warm light, old photographs, fresh flowers, books carefully arranged on shelves. Everything looked preserved rather than lived in, as though time moved differently there. Margaret led her toward a small closet near the hallway. Together they carried several storage boxes into the living room. Most contained holiday decorations, old ornaments, garlands, handwritten cards. Then one box shifted unexpectedly. A stack of photographs slipped free and scattered across the floor. Emily immediately knelt to help gather them. She stopped when she noticed the dates written on the backs. Every photograph came from the same year. 11 years ago. Summer picnics, beach trips, birthday dinners.
Ordinar i moments frusem foraver.
Then one image caught her attention. Daniel stood beside the apartment window smiling toward the camera. Behind him sunlight filled the room. Bright, golden, warm. Emily glanced toward the real window hidden behind the curtains only a few feet away. Something about the photograph felt important. Before she could study it longer, Margaret gently took it back. Her fingers lingered on the image. That was the last summer, she whispered. The room grew quiet. Emily looked at her carefully. The last summer before what? For the first time, Margaret did not answer immediately. She lowered her eyes toward the photograph and held it against her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Before everything changed the day I looked through that window and saw something I have never been able to forget. The room remained quiet after Margaret spoke. Outside, a cold wind rattled against the building windows. Inside apartment 7B, only the soft glow of a lamp illuminated the photographs scattered across the table. Emily did not push for answers. She sensed that whatever lived behind those words had been locked away for a very long time. Margaret slowly placed the photograph back into the box. Her movements were careful, almost ritualistic, like someone handling something fragile enough to break all over again. For several minutes they continued sorting decorations in silence. Then Margaret surprised her. "Would you like some tea?" Emily nodded. While Margaret disappeared into the kitchen, Emily glanced around the apartment once more. Everywhere she looked, pieces of Daniel remained. Photographs, cards, books with his name written inside the cover. A worn coffee mug resting on a shelf. It felt less like a home shared by memories and more like a place preserved in their honor. When Margaret returned, she carried 2 cups of tea and sat down near the hidden window. The curtains remained tightly closed as always. Emily settled into the chair opposite her. Neither woman touched the tea immediately. Finally, Margaret looked toward the curtains. "For years, people assumed I closed them because I wanted to hide." She smiled sadly. "The truth is exactly the opposite." Emily listened carefully. "What do you mean?" Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "I closed them because I could not stop looking." The answer lingered between them. Mysterious, incomplete, yet somehow heartbreaking. Margaret took a slow breath. "The day everything changed, I was standing right there." She pointed toward the hidden window. It was a Saturday afternoon. Daniel had gone out earlier. We were supposed to meet friends for dinner that evening. Her eyes drifted toward the curtains again. Not seeing them, seeing something far beyond them. I remember sunlight filling the room. I remember thinking it was unusually warm for October. Emily remained silent. She could feel Margaret moving closer to a memory she rarely allowed herself to visit. "I was waiting for him to come home." Another pause followed, longer this time. Then I looked outside. Her voice nearly disappeared. The apartment felt smaller. The city noise beyond the walls seemed very far away. "Some moments divide your life into 2 parts," Margaret whispered. "Everything before, everything after." Emily felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. She realized this was not simply the story of losing someone. It was the story of witnessing the exact moment life changed forever. Margaret lowered her gaze. "For years I thought if I never looked through that window again, I could keep that moment from happening over and over inside my head." Tears glistened in her eyes, though none fell. "I was wrong." The room returned to silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that arrives when a truth is finally spoken aloud. Then Emily noticed something unexpected. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the wooden box resting on the table. The same protective look appeared on her face. Stronger than before. Stronger even than when she spoke about Daniel. That was when Emily understood something important. The box was not connected only to Daniel. It was connected to the day everything changed. And whatever was hidden inside it carried a truth Margaret still could not bring herself to share. The days that followed felt different. Not because Margaret suddenly changed. She still bought flowers. She still kept the curtains closed. She still spent most of her time alone. But something invisible had shifted. For the first time in years, someone knew there was a story behind the silence. Someone was listening. A week before Christmas, snow began falling lightly over the city. The sidewalks turned white. Store windows glowed with holiday lights. The apartment building filled with the sounds of families arriving for visits. Yet apartment 7B remained as quiet as ever. One evening, Emily returned home carrying a small box of Christmas cookies. On impulse, she knocked on Margaret's door. When the older woman answered, Emily held out the box. "My mother always mailed too many," she said with a smile. Margaret laughed softly. It was the first genuine laugh Emily had heard from her. "Then I suppose I should help solve the problem." To Emily's surprise, Margaret invited her inside. They sat together drinking tea while snow drifted past the hidden window beyond the curtains. The conversation wandered through simple subjects. Favorite books. Childhood memories. Holiday traditions. For a little while, the apartment felt less like a museum of grief and more like a home. Then Margaret stood and walked toward a bookshelf. She pulled out an old photo album and placed it gently on the table. "Daniel loved taking pictures," she said. Emily opened the album carefully. Page after page revealed a life filled with ordinary happiness. Road trips. Backyard barbecues. Birthdays. Rainy afternoons spent reading together. The photographs were not extraordinary. That was what made them beautiful. They captured the quiet moments people often forget to treasure until they become memories. As Emily turned another page, she stopped. There was a photograph she had never seen before. Daniel stood beside a dark blue sedan parked across the street from the apartment building. Behind him, apartment 7B was visible in the background. More specifically, the living room window. The same window hidden behind the curtains now. Emily stared at the image. Something about it felt important. Margaret noticed immediately. "That was taken 3 days before everything changed," she said quietly. Emily looked up. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "I almost threw that picture away many times." "Why?" Emily asked. Margaret took a slow breath. "Because it captured the last normal week of our lives." Silence settled between them again. Then Margaret surprised her. She stood and crossed the room toward the wooden box. For several seconds she simply rested her hand on the lid. The movement seemed automatic, like someone touching a scar they had carried for years. "There is something inside this box I have never shown anyone," she said. Emily remained still. Even the air in the room seemed to pause. Margaret's fingers traced the brass latch. Not family. Not friends. No one. She looked toward the curtains. "Because once someone sees it, they will understand why I could never open that window again." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. For months she had searched for answers hidden inside photographs, flowers, letters, and memories. Yet all along, the truth had been waiting inside this small wooden box. Margaret slowly lifted the latch. Then she stopped. Her hand trembled slightly. The room fell completely silent. And after 11 years of protecting that secret, Margaret whispered the words she had been afraid to say. "I do not know if I am ready for anyone else to see what is in here." Margaret's hand remained on the wooden box long after her words faded. Snow drifted quietly outside. The apartment felt suspended between past and present, between silence and confession. Emily did not speak. She understood that some truths could not be rushed. Eventually Margaret released a slow breath and opened the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly organized envelopes, photographs, and small keepsakes. Nothing looked extraordinary at first glance. No dramatic secret. No shocking discovery. Just pieces of a life. Yet Margaret stared at them as though they weighed more than anything else in the room. Carefully, she removed a single envelope. It was yellowed with age. The edges were worn from being handled countless times. She held it for several seconds before passing it across the table. "Read the date," she whispered. Emily looked down. October 14th, 11 years ago. The same day everything changed. Her heart began to race. Daniel wrote this? Margaret nodded. That morning. Emily looked at the envelope but did not open it. "I never read it until 3 months later," Margaret said quietly. The statement surprised her. "Why?" Margaret stared toward the hidden window. "Because I could not." The answer carried years of pain inside it. After a long silence, she continued. "He left it on the kitchen counter before he went out. He told me not to open it until dinner." A faint smile crossed her face. Daniel always loved surprises. The smile disappeared almost immediately. But dinner never happened. Emily's chest tightened. She looked down at the envelope again. Suddenly it felt less like paper and more like a frozen moment in time. Margaret folded her hands together. For 3 months it sat exactly where he left it. I could not touch it. I could not move it. Every time I looked at it, I remembered that afternoon. The room grew quiet again. Outside, snow continued falling beyond the curtains neither woman could see. Finally, Emily asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. What happened that day? Margaret closed her eyes. For several moments she seemed unable to answer. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she began. "I was waiting for him to come home." Her voice remained calm, but Emily could hear the effort behind every word. "I remember standing near the window because I thought I saw his car turning onto the street." Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the box. "I remember smiling." The sentence nearly broke Emily's heart. Not because of what happened next, because of the happiness that came before it. Margaret opened her eyes. They looked distant now, lost somewhere 11 years away. Then I realized it was not Daniel's car. Another pause followed. A few minutes later, someone knocked on my door. Emily listened without moving. 2 police officers. The words hung heavily in the air. Not because they described anything graphic, because everyone understood what they meant. Margaret lowered her gaze. The rest of that day feels blurred now. I remember faces, voices, questions. I remember sitting beside that window for hours after everyone left. Her eyes drifted toward the curtains once more. And I remember staring at the street until sunrise. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. For the first time she truly understood. The window was not simply connected to loss. It was connected to the final ordinary moment before Margaret's world changed forever. Then Margaret reached deeper into the box and removed something else. A small photograph folded in half. Her expression immediately shifted. This was different from the letters, different from the memories, different from Daniel. And when Emily saw the fear in Margaret's eyes, she realized the true secret of the box had not been revealed yet. Margaret held the folded photograph between her fingers as though it contained something fragile enough to shatter. The warmth that had briefly entered the room disappeared. Emily noticed the change immediately. For months she had watched Margaret protect memories of Daniel. This felt different. This felt like fear. The older woman stared down at the photograph for a long time before speaking. "I almost destroyed this more times than I can count," she said quietly. "But I never could." Emily remained silent. She had learned that Margaret's story arrived in pieces, never all at once. Slowly, Margaret unfolded the photograph and placed it on the table. At first glance it seemed ordinary. It showed the living room of apartment 7B. Sunlight streamed through the uncovered window. Daniel stood smiling beside a chair, holding a coffee mug. Everything appeared normal. Yet Margaret's eyes remained fixed on a small detail near the edge of the frame. Emily leaned closer. There, partially visible on a side table, sat the wooden box. The same box resting between them now. "This picture was taken 2 days before he died," Margaret said. "It was the last photograph ever taken inside this apartment." Emily studied it again. Nothing seemed unusual. Margaret noticed her confusion. "That is because the secret is not in the photograph itself." Her voice softened. "It is what happened afterward." Snow continued falling outside. The city lights reflected faintly against the curtains. Margaret reached into the box once more and removed a small notebook. Its cover was faded blue. The pages looked worn from years of handling. Daniel kept journals, she explained. Not every day. Just when something mattered. Emily listened carefully. Margaret opened the notebook to a page marked with a ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly. This was his final entry. The room felt impossibly quiet. Margaret looked down and began reading. The words were simple. Daniel wrote about ordinary things. Coffee that morning. A joke Margaret had told at breakfast. Plans for dinner that evening. Then, near the bottom of the page, one sentence stood alone. Margaret stopped reading when she reached it. Her eyes filled with tears. Emily waited. Finally, Margaret whispered the line from memory instead. If anything ever happens to me, I hope Margaret remembers that happiness was never the problem. Happiness was always the gift. Silence followed. Emily felt her throat tighten. The sentence carried an unbearable kind of kindness. Margaret carefully closed the notebook. For years I hated those words, she admitted. Not because of what they meant. Because he somehow understood something I could not. She looked toward the hidden window. I spent 11 years treating happiness like a betrayal. Emily stared at her. Margaret gave a small broken smile. Every time I laughed, I felt guilty. Every time I enjoyed a good day, I felt guilty. Every time sunlight touched the curtains, I felt guilty. The confession seemed heavier than anything she had revealed before. Not because it involved Daniel's death. Because it exposed the prison she had built afterward. Then Margaret lowered her gaze to the photograph again. The window was never the real reason I closed myself off. Emily frowned slightly. The statement surprised her. For years Margaret had believed the window held the pain. Now she was saying something different. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the wooden box. The real reason is hidden beneath everything else in here. She reached toward the bottom compartment. And I have never told another person because I was afraid they would judge me for it. Margaret stared at the bottom compartment of the wooden box for so long that Emily wondered whether she might close it again and return the secret to silence. The older woman's eyes reflected years of hesitation. Not fear of the truth itself. Fear of finally saying it aloud. Slowly, she reached inside and removed a single folded sheet of paper. It was not a letter. Not a journal page. It looked ordinary. Almost disappointingly ordinary after so many years of mystery. Yet Margaret held it with both hands. This is what I have hidden from everyone, she said softly. Emily waited. Margaret unfolded the paper and placed it on the table between them. It was a receipt, dated the morning Daniel died. Emily looked at it confused. A gas station purchase. Coffee. A newspaper. Nothing unusual. Margaret noticed her expression. I know what you are thinking, she said. It seems meaningless. Her voice trembled slightly. But for 11 years I believed this piece of paper was responsible for everything. The room grew still. Emily looked closer. What do you mean? Margaret lowered her eyes. That morning Daniel was already running late. She swallowed carefully. He was halfway out the door when I asked him to stop and pick up my favorite newspaper from that gas station. Emily felt her chest tighten. She already understood where this was going. Margaret continued before she could speak. It was not important. I could have bought it myself later. I could have read the articles online. It did not matter. She stared at the faded receipt. But I asked anyway. Tears filled her eyes. And for 11 years I convinced myself that if I had not asked, everything would have happened differently. Emily finally understood. The secret hidden inside the box was not evidence. It was guilt. Quiet. Invisible. Crushing guilt. Margaret laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. Everyone thought I was grieving Daniel. She shook her head. I was also punishing myself. The confession seemed to empty something from her. Years of silence condensed into a single truth. Emily leaned forward. Margaret, you cannot know that. The older woman closed her eyes. I know that now. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But I did not know it then. Snow continued falling beyond the unseen window. Margaret looked toward the curtains. Every morning I woke up and replayed that conversation. Every single morning. If I had said nothing. If I had not asked. If I had let him leave 5 minutes earlier. Her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of memories. The window became a reminder. The flowers became a reminder. The apartment became a reminder. Emily reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Margaret's. For the first time, the older woman did not pull away. Daniel wrote that happiness was a gift, Emily said quietly. Do you think he would want you carrying this burden forever? Margaret stared at the receipt, then at the journal, then at the photographs surrounding them. Finally, she looked toward the hidden window. A long silence followed. When she spoke again, her voice sounded different. Softer. Tired. Honest. No. A tear slipped down her cheek. I think he would be heartbroken to know I spent 11 years believing his life could be reduced to a newspaper and a receipt. The room fell silent once more. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time since Emily had known her, Margaret no longer looked trapped by the past. She looked exhausted from carrying it. And sometimes exhaustion was the first step toward letting something go. The conversation stayed with both women long after that evening ended. For Margaret, it was the first time she had spoken the truth without hiding behind photographs, flowers, or routines. For Emily, it felt like watching someone slowly unlock a room they had been trapped inside for years. The next morning, sunlight reflected off fresh snow and filled the city with a quiet brightness. People hurried along sidewalks carrying shopping bags and cups of coffee. Children laughed near the park across the street. Life continued as it always had. Yet inside apartment 7B, something felt different. For the first time in 11 years, Margaret woke without immediately opening the wooden box. She noticed the change herself. Normally the box was the first thing she touched each morning. A ritual. A reminder. Punishment. This morning she simply sat beside it. Looking. Thinking. Later that afternoon, Emily knocked on her door carrying a small poinsettia plant. Margaret welcomed her inside. They spent the afternoon decorating a small Christmas tree together. The apartment had not seen holiday decorations in years. At first Margaret seemed uncertain. Every ornament carried memories. Every string of lights reminded her of celebrations she once shared with Daniel. Yet something unexpected happened as they worked. The memories remained painful, but they no longer felt unbearable. They felt real. Human. Part of a life that had existed instead of a life that had been stolen. At one point, Emily picked up an old ornament shaped like a tiny house. This one looks special, she said. Margaret smiled immediately. Daniel bought that during our first Christmas together. The smile lingered. Not forced. Not guilty. Genuine. Emily noticed it and said nothing. Some victories were too delicate to point out. As evening approached, snow began falling again. The apartment glowed softly beneath warm lights. For the first time, apartment 7B felt less like a place frozen in grief, and more like a home. Margaret stood quietly near the hidden window. Her eyes settled on the curtains. The familiar tension returned. 11 years of habit could not disappear overnight. She understood that. Healing was not a switch. It was a series of small decisions, some harder than others. Emily joined her near the window. Neither woman spoke for a while. They simply stood together listening to the muffled sounds of the city beyond the glass. Finally, Emily looked at her. Do you know what I think? Margaret smiled faintly. What? Emily glanced toward the curtains. I think Daniel would be proud of you for surviving. Margaret's eyes filled with tears immediately. Not because the words were dramatic, because nobody had ever said them before. People spoke about moving on, letting go, being strong. But surviving was different. Surviving acknowledged the cost. For several moments Margaret stared at the fabric covering the window. Then she whispered something so quietly Emily almost missed it. I do not know who I am without the guilt. The confession hung in the room. Honest. Vulnerable. Perhaps the most honest thing Margaret had said yet. Emily gently squeezed her hand. Maybe it is time to find out. Neither woman moved toward the curtains. Not yet. But for the first time, Margaret did not look away from them either. She simply stood there, facing the window she had spent 11 years avoiding, while snow fell softly outside and a small Christmas tree glowed behind her. And somewhere deep inside, a door she had kept locked for more than a decade finally began to open. Christmas morning arrived wrapped in silence. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks below. The city seemed softer than usual, as though the world itself had decided to slow down for a few hours. Inside apartment 7B, Margaret woke before sunrise. For a long time she remained seated at the edge of her bed listening to the quiet. No music.
No memories.
No ritual of opening the wooden box. Just stillness. Across the room, the curtains waited exactly where they had been for 11 years. The same curtains she had adjusted countless times without ever opening. The same curtains that had become a wall between her and the world. She stared at them for a long moment. Then she stood. Slowly. Carefully. Not because she was afraid of what she might see outside. She finally understood that fear was no longer the problem. The problem was believing she deserved to remain trapped. A few hours later, Emily knocked on the door carrying 2 cups of coffee. When Margaret opened it, something immediately felt different. Not dramatic. Subtle. The kind of change people notice before they understand it. Emily stepped inside and froze. The curtains were still closed. But for the first time sunlight was visible. A thin golden line stretched across the floor where the fabric had been parted less than an inch. Margaret noticed her reaction and smiled. "I know," she said softly. Emily looked at the narrow beam of light touching the hardwood floor. Such a small thing. Yet it felt enormous. Neither woman mentioned it immediately. They sat together beside the Christmas tree drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things. The weather. Holiday movies. Plans for the coming year. The conversation felt easy. Natural. Like 2 friends. At one point Margaret found herself laughing. Truly laughing. The sound surprised both of them. For a second she almost apologized out of habit. Then she remembered Daniel's journal. Happiness was never the problem. Happiness was always the gift. The thought settled gently into her heart. Later that afternoon, after Emily returned to her apartment, Margaret stood alone in the living room. The city beyond the window glowed beneath fresh snow. Families walked together along the sidewalks. Children pulled sleds through the park. Life continued moving forward. She looked around the apartment one last time. The photographs remained. The flowers remained. The letters remained. Daniel remained. Nothing had been erased. Nothing had been forgotten. That was the realization she had spent 11 years trying to reach. Opening the curtains would not mean leaving him behind. It would simply mean bringing the rest of her life back inside. Margaret stepped toward the window. Her hand rested against the fabric. For several seconds she closed her eyes. Then slowly she pulled. The curtains moved. Not all the way. Not dramatically. Just enough. Sunlight flooded across the room in warm golden bands. The light touched the photographs. The wooden box. The Christmas tree. The chair where she sat every evening. It touched every corner grief had once claimed for itself. Tears filled her eyes. Not because she was saying goodbye. Because she finally understood she did not have to. Down in the street below, nobody noticed the curtains moving in apartment 7B. Nobody stopped walking. Nobody pointed toward the window. The moment belonged only to her. A quiet victory witnessed by almost no one. Yet for Margaret Collins it was the bravest thing she had done in 11 years. She stood there surrounded by sunlight, memories, and peace. And for the first time since Daniel's last ordinary morning, the apartment no longer felt like the place where her life ended. It felt like the place where it began again.